Welcome to Chapter 9, students, and in this chapter I'm going to be breaking it down to several smaller lectures. They'll all be posted, all of the links will be posted for you on Moodle. So let us go ahead and start. First off, let's introduce the three different kinds of muscle tissue that we have. So when we think of muscle, we usually think of skeletal muscles, and those are the ones that are attached to our skeleton, hence the name skeletal muscles. These are voluntary. We can consciously control to contract them or not. Okay, so those are the only voluntary muscles that we have. The involuntary muscle fibers are your cardiac and smooth muscles. So cardiac muscles, those are, these muscle fibers are only found in the heart. Okay, so they make up the wall of the heart. Obviously, they are involuntary, so we cannot control whether to contract the heart or not. Okay, so, which is a good thing, okay, because you don't want to have to worry about that. And it is responsible for pumping the blood out of the heart. Smooth muscle fibers, those are also involuntary. They are not consciously controlled. And those are found in the walls of the internal organs, for example, in the esophagus, in the small intestine, in the large intestine, and so on. Again, these muscles work automatically and without any input from us, at least on a conscious level. We'll talk about the structure of a skeletal muscle. So when we're talking now, in the next couple of slides, these apply to skeletal muscle fibers only. They do not apply to smooth or cardiac. So skeletal muscle fibers, as we said, those are the muscles that are attached to bones, hence the name skeletal muscle, or they can also be attached to the skin of the face. And these ones that are attached to your skin of the face are responsible for facial expressions. But the other muscles that are attached to bones, those are responsible for joint movement. Again, these are under conscious or voluntary control, and each skeletal muscle is an organ of the muscular system. So, for example, the biceps is one organ. Triceps is another organ. We considered each individual muscle one organ of this bigger muscular system. Now, a muscle is not only made out of skeletal muscle tissue, it also has nervous tissue, blood supply, so an artery and a vein. It has connective tissue. There are lymphatics as well. So the skeletal muscle as an organ is made out of more than just the skeletal muscle tissue. But what we will be talking about in these next couple of slides will be your skeletal muscles, the tissue, just the tissue proper. Now, each muscle, as we said, is an individual organ, and each of these organs is surrounded by several layers or different layers of connective tissue. Each muscle has an envelope, and that envelope is known as fascia. So the connective tissue that we have is exactly the same connective tissue that you would see in a steak, for example. So that red would be skeletal muscles, and all of that white that you see scattered throughout your steak, that is connective tissue. And we have the same thing. Okay, so like I said, the fascia is considered the envelope of each muscle. So each muscle, the biceps, for example, would have its own fascia or its own envelope surrounding the muscle. If that fascia extends beyond the muscle fibers to connect to a bone, that is known as a tendon. So for example, you see that quadriceps muscle, and that is the muscle on the anterior part of the thigh. It will attach to the tibia with a very strong tendon. Okay, that tendon, again, is an extension of the fascia surrounding the quadriceps muscle. An aponeurosis is kind of the same as a tendon, but it is a flat tendon. So you have these aponeuroses that are extensions of fascia beyond the muscle. They either attach two muscles to each other, or they could attach muscle to bone and so on. But usually, most of the time, aponeurosis attach two muscles to each other. So for example, right here, we have the rectus abdominis muscle, and that is the muscle responsible for the six packs that you could see in the abdomen. Well, that whiteness that you see on top of it is the fascia. Okay, so that's the envelope covering it. And you can see here in the middle, there is that aponeurosis that is connecting the two fascia together. Another aponeurosis that you can see here is on the scalp. Okay, so between the frontalis muscle covering the front of the face and the occipitalis muscle that is on the back. The A here, the aponeurosis is the A in scalp. So scalp is actually an abbreviation. S stands for skin, C stands for connective tissue, A stands for aponeurosis, and that's your aponeurotic layer. L stands for loose connective tissue, and P stands for the periosteum of the skull. Okay, so that, again, aponeurosis is basically flat fascia connecting the frontalis muscle to the occipitalis muscle. In a lot of textbooks, some textbooks, they consider them as one muscle, so the fronto-occipitalis, either way is okay. Now for more muscle covering, so we already talked about the fascia. The fascia will extend beyond the skeletal muscle fibers, while others do not. So you can see here, this is a muscle that is connected to the bone through a tendon, and you can see that fascia surrounding the muscle, but it does extend beyond that red muscle fiber, connecting it to the bone. So that is your muscle fascia. You can see it, we're kind of cutting it and peeling it off. That is the tendon where the fascia is extending beyond the red muscle fibers, and you can see it connected to the bone. Excuse me. Underneath the fascia, there is an epimysium. So the epimysium is another layer of connective tissue that also surrounds the whole muscle. The difference between it and the fascia is the epimysium does not extend beyond the muscle fiber. So it would technically end where that redness ends, while the fascia does extend beyond. Now, that epimysium is going to send down extensions into the muscles proper, dividing it into smaller fascicles. So each fascicle will be surrounded with another layer of connective tissue known as the perimysium. We kind of pulled out one fascicle, and that fascicle is going to be surrounded by a layer of connective tissue that we call the perimysium. Now, the perimysium is going to send connective tissue extensions and surround each individual muscle cell. So this fiber or muscle cell has its own connective tissue surrounding it, and that is known as the endomysium. Okay, so epi means around or above. It actually means above. Peri means surrounding. Endo means on the inside. So your epimysium is on the outside. Peri is in the middle, and the endomysium is the one that surrounds the individual muscle fibers. That again, when you put together, you are going to be making a fascicle. Okay, so these are very common questions that students get asked about. So you want to be comfortable in answering them. So which connective tissue surrounds a whole muscle, does not extend beyond it? That would be epimysium. Which connective tissue surrounds the whole muscle and does extend or might extend? That would be your fascia. Which connective tissue surrounds a fascicle? And that would be the perimysium. Which connective tissue surrounds an individual muscle fiber? And that would be your endomysium. Okay. Now what, if you bring a whole group of muscle fibers together, what have you made? Well, you have made a fascicle. What if you bring a whole, bunch of fascicles together? What did you make? Well, you've made a muscle. So you want to be able to break down and then build back up this puzzle of muscles. Now, what does the skeletal muscle fiber look like? So a skeletal muscle fiber is technically just a different word for skeletal muscle cell. Remember when we talked about neuron and nerve cell, they are the same thing. Well, skeletal muscle fibers is the same thing as a skeletal muscle cell. They do not look like that perfect round cell that we talked about in chapter 3, where there's that, beautiful blue nucleus and all of the organelles swimming in the cytosol and so on. The skeletal muscle fiber has a totally different function. And that's why it has its very unique structure. This is what a skeletal muscle fiber looks like. And because it's a big cell, they are multinucleated. So you can see multiple nuclei for each cell. The cell membrane surrounding it is known as the sarcolemma. So sarco means flesh. Again, your sarcolemma is the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. Sarcoplasm is just the cytoplasm, but again, because it's the cytoplasm of muscle, so we call it a sarcoplasm. Even the endoplasmic reticulum gets a very unique name called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or the SR. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum are these orange tubes, those orange channels that you see here. Remember that the function of any endoplasmic reticulum was to make lipids and to store calcium. And that is extremely important when it comes to skeletal muscle fibers and muscle contraction. So please remember, the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium and will release that calcium in order for the muscles to contract. In between, and they store the calcium, to be very specific, in these cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. These cisterns are those little tubes that you see on either side of that yellow tube. Now that yellow tube is known as the transverse tubule, or the T-tubule. That is another really important structure. Let us figure out first, what is that T-tubule? Well, the T-tubule is an extension or an invagination of the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma has these little pores, and so you can see a pore here, and then it will extend into the actual muscle cell. And that is known as your T-tubule. So again, the T-tubule connects the inside of the muscle cell to the outside of the muscle cell. And that is how the action potential, or the electricity, will come from out to inside of the cell to help to start the process of muscle contraction. So again, that T-tubule and these two cisterns of sarcoplasmic reticulum, all three of them together are known as a triad. So that triad, one T-tubule and the two sarcoplasmic reticulum cisternae, are really important for muscle contraction. The T-tubule will bring in the action potential, or the electricity, to the inside of the cell, and this, the cisterns are going to release the calcium that was stored in there, and that will start the process of muscle contraction. Another thing to keep in mind where we're looking are all of these lines. So remember, we said that skeletal muscle fibers are striated, and that's where the striation comes from, because of all of these myofibrils. We have thin filaments, or micro myofilaments, and that, for example, actin. We also have thick filaments, for instance, myosin. So you can see here, these thicker ones are your myosin protein fibers, while the thinner ones are made out of actin. We do have other thin filaments that we'll talk about. The only thick filament that we mention is myosin. And you want to make sure that you are good. Which one is the thin? Which one is the thick? So your thin is the active one, actin filament, while the thick one is the muscular, bulky filaments, and those are known as myosin filaments. Here you can see these myofibrils put together, and they make what is known as the building blocks of muscles, and those are called sarcomeres. So let's first off, know the difference between a myofibril and a myofilament. So the myofilament is the actin alone, or the myosin alone. When you put them together, we call them myofibrils. Okay, so all of these, the actin and myosin come together and they make these building blocks known as a sarcomere. It goes from this zigzag line, also called a Z line, to the next Z line. So this unit is sarcomere. In order for a muscle to contract, you need hundreds and thousands of these healthy sarcomeres. So let's take a look at what the breakdown of a sarcomere really looks like. So we know that these thin proteins are actin, The thicker ones are myosin. Now these thin ones, where they connect together or hold hands, produces this Z line, while these myosin fibers hold hands in the middle. And you could see these, maybe dots. Hopefully you're able to see them clearly, though. That is known as the M line. Okay, so M line and Z line. Again, the sarcomere from one Z line to the next Z line. And M lines is where the myosin filaments attach. Now, the sarcomere is made out of different bands and different zones, and we want to be able to identify them. So the area where you only have thick myosin fibers, that is known as the H zone. The area where you have both thick and thin fibers, that's known as the A band. And the area where you have only thin filaments, that is known as the I band. In order to remember, which one is which band and zone and so on, the thin filaments area is made out of a thin letter, and that would be your I band. The area that only has thick filaments is a thicker letter, that would be H. While the area that has both thin and thick filaments is made out of a letter where one side, the lower side is thick, while the upper side is thin, which would be your A band. Okay, that's how I, up until this day, actually remember these different zones and different bands. Here again are the different parts of the sarcomere, and like I said, the striations that you see under an electron microscope for skeletal muscles are due to the configuration, due to these myosin and actin filaments that are found perfectly parallel to each other. Again, your I band is where you only have the thin filaments, the thin actin filaments. The A band is where you have both thick and thin, where they overlap. And the H zone is where you only have the thick filaments. Okay, that would be more in the middle. It's right in the middle of the A band. Your Z line is where your these actin fibers connect to each other or anchor to each other, while your M line is where the myosin fibers connect to each other. Now, what are all of these thick versus thin filaments? So like I said, the thick filaments that we're going to be talking about are the myosin protein. And these are the myosin proteins that you see here. So each one of these filaments, each one of these threads is a singular myosin protein. And they all have what are known as these myosin heads. They kind of look like a heart-shaped area. So again, your myosin protein are your thicker ones. They, obviously there are, several of them that can attach together to make a thick filament. And each one of these threads ends in a head that we call a myosin head. Now, what about the thin filaments? So the thin filaments are made out of actin molecules. So each one of these little tiny, spheres is an actin protein. They connect together to kind of make a chain, and those are your actin filaments or actin molecules. But you can also see these other proteins, which are also thin proteins, and those are known as your tropomyosin and troponin. So tropomyosin covers the active binding sites of actin. So when a muscle contracts, what really happens is that this myosin head attaches to an attachment site or an active site found on actin. But this muscle right here, this fiber here is not contracted, it's relaxed. So the myosin head is detached from actin. And that is because those attachment sites are covered by this rope-shaped protein known as tropomyosin. Okay, so tropomyosin again covers the binding sites that are on actin, and these binding sites, this is what myosin head latches onto in order to contract. Tropomyosin, though, can roll over, they can move around, so in order to keep them in position, we have these little tiny rocks that kind of look like rocket-shaped structures. That is troponin. Okay, and in order for a muscle to contract, and this is just a very quick review because we are going to talk about it in detail in another video, is that when the action potential or the order comes into the muscle to contract, calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It attaches to troponin. Troponin protein will change its configuration, change its shape, and that means that it'll kind of get out of the way. So tropomyosin now rolls over, and that will expose the binding sites on actin. Now this myosin head will be able to latch onto actin and bend or contract. So I'll show you a little video to kind of explain how this works.
Myofilaments are composed of strings of the proteins actin and myosin. An actin filament has two strands of actin molecules wrapped together. A myosin filament has many myosin proteins packed together, and each myosin protein has a globular head region that protrudes from the filament. Myofilaments can contract or shorten due to interactions between the myosin heads and the actin filaments. Contraction begins with the head of myosin molecules bound to actin on the actin filament. While still bound to actin, the myosin head flexes, pulling the actin filament along with it. This causes the actin filament to slide by the myosin filament. Then the myosin head releases from the actin and unflexes, a change that is powered by ATP. This frees the myosin head to bind with a different actin molecule farther up the actin filament. The entire process may then be repeated many times. The myosin, in effect, walks along the actin filament, moving the actin filament more each time. Myofilaments are...
So you've seen here in the video how these are your myosin, that's your myosin head, these are actin proteins, and these are your active or the binding sites on actin. And we saw how the myosin head was bending, and we call that a power stroke, and how the actin filaments were sliding on top of myosin. And another thing to keep in mind was the ATP. So this whole process obviously needs energy, and we get that energy from ATP. Okay, so for skeletal muscle contraction to occur, as we've seen in the video and we talked about, it requires the interaction between all different chemicals like ATP and cellular components like actin and myosin. It will result from the movement among those myofibrils where actin is going to slide right on top of myosin, and that is going to lead to the shortening of the sarcomere. The muscle fiber is then going to, as a whole, the muscle is going to shorten, and that's going to pull on the attachment points. So you can now bend your elbow or perform a certain facial expression if we're talking about the muscles of facial expression, and so on. Okay, so this is, how the physiology of how a muscle can contract. So I'm going to, at this point, end part 1 and ask you to take a break and come back for episode 2.